Hello, hello. It's time for the midweek message. Welcome to our usual Wednesday time to think together and pray together. And in this case, we're going to prep for Sunday by reading a little scripture together. So here we go. We are going to think about Acts 9:36 to 43, and that's the story of Tabitha. I'm going to read it to you. So here we go. Down the road away in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which means gazelle in our language. She was well known for doing good and helping out. During the time Peter was in the area, she became sick and she died. Her friends prepared her body for burial and put her in a cool room. Some of the disciples had heard that Peter was visiting in nearby Lydda and sent two men to see if he would be so kind as to come over. Peter got right up and went with them. They took him out into the room where Tabitha's body was laid out. Her old friends, most of them widows, were in the room mourning. They showed Peter pieces of clothing that Tabitha, the gazelle, had made while she was with them. Peter put the widows all out of the room gently, and then he knelt down and prayed. And then he spoke directly to her body and said, "Tabitha, get up." And she opened her eyes. When she saw Peter, she sat up. He took her hand and he helped her up. Then he called in the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. When this became known all over Joppa, many put their trust in the Master. Peter stayed on a long time in Joppa as the guest of Simon the tanner. Okay, there we go. That's the story. Now, I want to point out to you that this story is not so much about Peter as it is about Tabitha herself, who is also known as Dorcas, which also means gazelle. And what's interesting is in a lot of the stories, you hear some of the widows calling her Dorcas and some of them calling her Tabitha, which means that she was known in both the Hebraic, because Tabitha is a Hebraic name, and the Greek communities. So she was known and loved in both, like, the sort of inner and the outer community. And she was just the quintessential Easter person. She shared her love of God by spending lots of her time sewing clothes for people who needed them. And they were beautiful, things that were so nice that people brought them to show each other, to sort of help with the grief process and to show Peter. Now, not very many of us today have clothes that were made especially for us, but we often have special clothes that were given to us by a friend or a relative. And I want to show you a couple of things that are special to me. So, one is this. Now, sometimes you see the other side of this behind me on the chair. Um, that this is a little quilt that was made for Kira, my second daughter, when she was quite ill and in hospital. And she loved it because it was so bright and pretty, and she was so sick. And she used it all the time, the whole time she was in the hospital. And she used it a lot when she got home, but eventually it got folded up and put away. But I use it all the time, and I am grateful to the lovely, lovely lady who gave it to her because it really cheered her up in a tough time where she felt quite sick. So it means a lot to me. I want to tell you about another quilt that I have that I love dearly, and that is one that my friend Lynn had made for me. Thank you, Lynn. Lynn was one of the church members in Yarker at Riverside Church, and she had a quilt made for me when I was sick with cancer. And I took it with me to chemo every time because I got really cold in there and it was winter, and so I had a lot of trouble. A lot of people in the summer have trouble with hot. Not me. I was cold the entire time um, uh, during the chemo process, and I brought it in, and it kept me warm, and it also reminded me of somebody who loves me enough to do this kind thing. Finally, I have. And I dragged this out of the box, so it is wrinkled, but I have to show it to you. This is my mother's wedding dress. You can't really see how beautiful it is. I mean, it's a thing of beauty for me because, of course, I am a tremendously sentimental person, but my grandmother and my mother made this together for her wedding. So it was made, so she and her mom made this to And it's beautiful, and it's tiny because my mom was so little. I think she was only like 5'6", 5'7". She was not a big person. And no, that's right. I think she might have only been 5'5". She was really short compared to me. By the time I grew into myself, she was so teeny, and no matter how much weight I lose, I will never get into it because her little rib cage was tiny compared to mine. But I love that dress. And when I see it, I think about how much they loved each other, that they would do this together. I love all of these pieces because they're the stories that attach me to them are special parts of my family history. And they're all about love. They're all about love. Love that was great enough to reach out when something special was happening, when like my mom, that's a big piece of her life. And then the fact that I have it just means a lot to me too. I have to thank my cousin Betty for finding it because it was actually squirreled away in my aunt's attic and no one could find it for years. Mom had no idea what happened to it. And my cousin Betty, God bless her, found it up in the attic and sent it to me. But the two quilts especially remind me of love, love in tough times. Those stories, of course, should remind you about Tabitha, this lovely woman. She is actually the only person in the book of Acts that is the only woman who is named as a disciple. So she's not just, like one of the people in the church. She was actually considered a disciple. So she was really an important person for the early church. So I would like you to imagine with me the people who were mourning Tabitha, wearing the clothes that she made for them and bringing what she made for them to honor her in her death and as a part of a way of grieving, but just showing each other these tangible pieces of love, these tangible times and things that showed Tabitha's love for them. Now, I now imagine with me what we could bring or say or do to show that kind of loving care to those we know who might need something. I mean, not all people sew, of course, but all Easter people, and we are an Easter people, are called to care for the people around them in some way. What could we do? What could we do knowing God's love, having experienced God's love, and knowing that love is a verb, love is a form of action, love is doing? What could we do this week to show that love to someone else? Now, take another moment, and I want you to imagine what would the wider community of Cumberland miss about us if we cease to exist? If St. Andrew's United Church ceased to exist, what would the wider community miss about us? Would there be great mourning? Would people show up with the gifts or the stories of kindness shared, of purpose and vocation found and fostered in our midst, of lives touched by love, of faith restored? Would there be someone like Peter trying to resurrect us because we are so sorely needed in our community? Now, if you're saying, well, no, and stop saying things like that, Reverend Stephanie, I want to say that to you that I'm not saying this to guilt you. I am not saying this to guilt you in any way. What I am saying is that I'm saying this to help us remember and act upon our vocation, our purpose as people who have experienced God's love, of people who have chosen to be Christ followers together as a community. So, what does that look like in action in our congregation? And especially now that we are able to gather again and knowing that what we have gone through with COVID and seeing how the world has changed as a result, how can we change? How can we change with the needs of our times? How can we prayerfully and faithfully meet the changes, help people to find their faith and their vocation together with us? And how can we find our voice and our sense of purpose as a community again, as we are gathering in person again? How can we do that? Because we know we are called to love and serve God by loving and serving the people of Cumberland and the surrounding area. We know this to be true. So I leave you with this week with a challenge. Read the story of Tabitha. Read the story of Tabitha in Acts. Go back up. Hang on. It is Acts. I can never remember the Acts chapter 9, verses 36 to 43. Go back and read that. Marvel at how much she was loved and how many people's lives she touched, that those people would show up with those items of clothing and all want to gather to mourn this special person who really was a Christ follower, in that she so clearly followed the example of Jesus in the, as far as the what would Jesus do, she really lived that out. She touched a lot of people's lives. When you reread that story, and I hope that you will, and we are, of course, are going to read it on Sunday at church, ask God and ask each other, how can we become like Tabitha? How can we become that vocational, loving, purposeful people that help others, that help them meet their needs, that help them find their faith and their purpose? And how can we find ours again? Okay, so until next week, and certainly on Sunday, in this together with you, Reverend Stephanie signing off.